Hi, my name is Hope Houston, and you're listening to Kinda Sorta Brown with University of Chicago's Public Policy Podcast.
Hey y'all, welcome back to KSB. I'm your host, Chase Lito, and we also have
your second host, Daisy Okoye.
And today we're going to be talking about election season and the voting game. We have a special guest, Liliana Zaragoza from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who's going to talk to us about existing forms of voter suppression. And Daisy and I are going to dive into the different ways in which communities of color really showed up and showed out this election season, some of the impacts that communities of color have had on this election, and also some of the election results, not only with presidential results, but also some of the states that made some interesting choices this time around. And we'll start off with Daisy, who's going to drop some facts in the Melanin archive. Let's dig into the Melanin archives.
Okay, so in this installment of the Melanin archives, I wanted to talk a little bit about this case called Texas NAACP versus Steen, which was consolidated with VC v. Abbott. Basically, it was in regards to a Senate bill called Senate Bill 14, which passed in 2011, the strictest voting ID law in the United States. It required an up-to-date photo ID from a list of only 7 acceptable documents. Experts estimated that more than 600,000 registered Texas voters and so many more unregistered but eligible voters did not have this type of ID. So on September 1st, 2013, the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, which is basically a law and public policy institute, filed a lawsuit to oppose this really, really strict photo voter ID law on behalf of the Texas State Conference of the NAACP and the Mexican American Legislative Caucus of the Texas House of Representatives. And since this lawsuit was filed, a federal district court has found twice that the Texas legislature passed this ID law with a discriminatory intent, and a court of appeals affirmed that the law had been discriminatory in effect on both African Americans and the Latinx population of voters. So in 2017, in response to the lawsuit, the Texas legislature revised this voter ID law. And we're going to talk a little bit more about voter suppression and the results of this specific case in the KST.
KST. It's piping hot.
The case in 2013 that Daisy was referring to in the Melanin archives is only one of the many forms of voter suppression that we've seen, from mail-in ballots to voter ID to poll taxes to other forms of voter suppression and disenfranchisement. Yet, this time around, none of those barriers were able to stop a Democratic win and were unable to stop some of the states from flipping and turning from red to blue. So, racism's resolved, right? No more racism in America, right, guys?
Chase, I don't know if we can say all that yet, but I kind of did have a question in regards to voter suppression, but specifically talking about the high levels of voter turnout that we were seeing in this election season. Why was voter turnout so high? And just to kind of give you some numbers, according to the Pew Research Center, Americans voted in the 2020 presidential election at their highest rate in 120 years. For Democrat Joe Biden, he earned 74 million votes as of November 6th, while the Republican Donald Trump received nearly 70 million votes. This is the most and the second most in U.S. history. So why was voter turnout so high? And specifically, what got voter turnout up in like communities of color, marginalized communities?
Well, first of all, it's kind of incredible that we had such a high voter turnout despite us being in the middle of a pandemic. It's also a little concerning that while Joe Biden got the most votes that any president has ever gotten, Donald Trump also got the second most votes in U.S. history. But some of the reasons why we had such a high voter turnout this time around was the Get Out the Vote push, or GOTV, as community organizers like to refer it as. You know, a big push from community organizers, a big push from different celebrities, specifically the NAACP collaborating with different Black celebrities telling Black voters to make sure that they're registered and make sure that they mail in their ballots early. We also had other efforts from political action organizations such as Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight and the New Georgia Project, which aimed to increase voter registration. Estimated more than 800,000 new people have registered to vote in Georgia since 2018 because of the efforts of Stacey Abrams. And there was a 45% increase of new voters that were under the age of 30, and 49% are people of color. Now, that is amazing and incredible. And one of the big reasons why Georgia turned blue. Besides that, we also have other people such as Latasha Brown, who is the co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, which does work in Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and a bunch of other southern states, as well as organizers of color who were in communities of color in Wisconsin, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, and in a bunch of other states that were battleground states this time around. So those are some of the reasons why we had like such a big voter turnout this time. And, like one question that comes up with all of these results is, why did the Democratic Party even win in the first place?
Right. And I would love to answer that question. But first, I feel like I have to mention this one advertisement that was floating around the Atlanta scene. I don't know if you saw it, the Get Your Booty to the Pole video. I had to throw that in there. It was so fun. And obviously it had some impact. So that's always good. Why did the Democratic Party win? Well, there are a lot of kind of reasons we can point to. We can point to anti-Trump sentiments in the country. We can point to repercussions of like not voting in 2016. So people who didn't feel as incentivized to vote in 2016 because maybe neither of the candidates were really appealing to them. These kinds of voters may have seen what has happened over the past 4 years and really decided that we needed to change. People could have gone out to vote because of economic reasons in the pandemic itself, and our current president or Donald Trump's handling of the pandemic. We also had like mass social unrest this summer, continuing into the fall and probably for a long time, which is in the Black Lives Matter movement, people being unhappy just generally, being incentivized to take advantage of familiar avenues of change, not the only avenues, but familiar avenues in both swing states. And then we saw like the massive increase in voter turnout from Georgia and all of these different states that really did get out the vote this time.
All of those reasons are really, really important to keep in mind. It's because of communities of color, it's because of Black voters that Joe Biden has won this election. And for me, what I've been thinking a lot about what that means, that, this election was so close and that the majority of people that voted for Joe Biden were people of color, were Asian people, were Black people, were Latinx people, were Indigenous people. And, that's a little unsettling to me because you still had the majority of this country still voting for a person who exhibits fascism, a person who exhibits racism. And for me, I think that Joe Biden acknowledges that he owes his win to Black voters specifically, but at the end of the day, he also has to be the president for everybody. And I imagine a lot of his work is going to be centered around reuniting the country after such time of polarization that we've seen over the past 4 years, and also possibly just like a brushing to the side of certain issues that have come up for Black voters, such as, criminal justice reform, such as defunding the police, things that Joe Biden has actively worked against during his time in the Senate and also during his time as vice president as well.
Yeah, I think being that one of the core messages of Kind of Sort of Brown is tapping into intersectionality, it's really interesting, again, that something like 91% of Black women voted Democrat, voted blue. And knowing that at the intersection of being Black, so we know that majority of Black voters voted Democrat, but also majority of women voters voted Democrat as well. That kind of power that is in those identities, and then that coming together to incentivize Black women voters to vote for the Democratic Party, it's very interesting when you look at it that way. And I think there are a lot of other intersections of the voting population that you can look at in a similar way and find very interesting results. But turning back to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the kind of history that they have with issues regarding the Black community and regarding communities of color, on policing and on different aspects of the social unrest that we've seen this summer and in the past year, there is still a lot to worry about. Like, even beyond the claims of voter fraud, false claims of voter fraud, we have a Black and Indian female vice president, but we also have a Black and Indian female vice president that has a record in the Black community of being a really, really intense judge, having a history and a record of like legal rulings that are not beneficial or that are not appealing to the Black community and to communities of color. So looking at that as well is another intersection that is interesting and not always like beneficial or appealing in any way.
Yeah, and I think that it is important to acknowledge that we have made progress. You know, we have our first female vice president. We have our first Black and Indian female vice president. And that is a very important historic moment to acknowledge. But at the same time, we do have to remember the histories of these two politicians.
Right, for sure.
And just acknowledge that this is a win, but it's not a win in the way that many people imagined when this process started out. And it's more of just a way for us to continue the necessary work that needs to be done, whether it be, you know, within the new Biden administration or outside of that as well. This win kind of makes me think about a lot of the different states that surprisingly like flipped this time around that like led to the Biden administration winning the presidency, such as Georgia. Like, no one expected Georgia to flip blue. No one expected Arizona to flip blue either. And you had other states such as Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada who were red last time around in 2016, but have now turned blue. What do we owe these sort of changes in different states? Like, who do we owe that to?
I think this all goes back to like the community organizers and everyone who really worked on the ground to get voting rates up in marginalized communities, everyone who was incentivized by what has been going on for the past 4 years and felt the need to make their voices heard and to make themselves heard. I think those are definitely really large parts of why these areas turned blue. And in the case of Florida, Ohio, and Iowa staying with Trump, I would also like really be interested in hearing your thoughts on why they stayed that way. I think a lot of people kind of placed hope on Florida turning blue, and then when it didn't, you know, there were a lot of posts going around about like, Florida, like, come on, like, you could have done it. We were waiting for you. We were rooting for you. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on like why that is.
Yeah, so a little backstory. I actually was an community organizer in Iowa in 2018, the summer after my first year of college, working on a different presidential campaign. And I think in that experience, I learned a lot about what goes on in organizing and things like that. And what's interesting is so many people place so much attention on Iowa and so much organizing happened there just for it to stay red. I think some of the reasons why these different states stayed red is because they have a higher rural population, you know, such as like in particular with Iowa and Ohio. And also, you know, in Florida, you have a lot of rich, white, affluent people who didn't like Biden's tax plan and went for Trump solely because they wanted to keep their taxes low, keep their income high, and ensure that their assets were still secured. And I think, you know, a lot of what goes into those two factors is that those two populations vote all the time. They are traditionally taught to feel empowered to vote and to have their voice heard. Whereas, you know, Black communities, Latinx communities, and Indigenous communities don't have that same empowerment because of the histories of voter suppression that those communities have faced that white and affluent communities just haven't faced. Also, this false rhetoric going around about Biden being a socialist, Biden